5 tips for cramming for your fantasy drafts. So the first thing that we're going to be getting into is knowing your league settings and analyze previous drafts. So this is kind of a 2-in-1, but you want to make sure you know how many teams are going to be in your league. Make sure what scoring format, standard, half point, or full point PPR. If there are any special scoring formats like bonuses for distances or anything like that. Whether or not it's Superflex. So make sure that you know if you're going to need a second quarterback in your starting lineups, how many IR spots you have, so you can be maybe a little bit more aggressive on guys that are already a little bit dinged up, or if you have a place to put guys that are starting on IR, it's good to know that going in. And then analyzing your previous drafts should help you plan for which players you can get in which rounds, and roughly where all of the players are going to go. So there's obviously nuances to every draft, so you can kind of start there and then build the players for this year into what you think might happen. But it's always good to look back at the other people in your league's tendencies to see who you think you could get, and it helps you plan and helps you go through scenarios at each one of your picks as you go down the board. So definitely want to be looking at the data from years past.
Yeah, and that specifically is available on Sleeper. So if you are drafting on Sleeper, make sure you do that. And as far as the scoring settings goes, I will call out 3 wide receiver specific. I mean, we see this in our home league that we've been doing 3 wide receiver for a long time. People still just don't lean into wide receiver enough, right? So you want to make sure that you have 4 rock solid options that are good to go, because the position does thin out pretty quick. And of course, if you are in a PPR league, that will push the quarterbacks down a little bit. Standard scoring, if you're still playing that, definitely pushes the quarterbacks up. And then as well as the roster spots, I know you touched on it, but guys like Brandon Ayuk, Chris Godwin, Joe Mixon are a little bit more draftable, obviously within reason when you can stash them IR.
Another thing here with the settings specifically is the smaller the starting rosters, the more important it is to get in on top end quarterbacks specifically. Maybe you even want to be a little bit more aggressive at tight end if you have a smaller starting lineup, because the pool of players that you're going to be drawing from for your starters is just that much thinner. So, if you get in on really good wide receiver, running back, but you get left behind at quarterback, get left behind at tight end, that maybe isn't the best strategy when you can mine for value later at running back and receiver. If you need a lot of receivers and running backs, if you have 3 wide receivers and you have a flex and you have a super flex, right? That's where continuing to draft additional players, because you're going to need so many starters, becomes more valuable. So you might have seen in our draft that the tight ends just get pushed down so far, but it's because we have 9 starting players in our lineup, and then kicker and defense as well, so 11 total. And that isn't something that always happens, but it's definitely something you want to know and account for when you're prepping for your drafts. Second point here is know your draft site rankings, and make sure that you do mock drafts on the site that you're going to be using. So ESPN versus Yahoo versus Sleeper. Make sure you have your own tier of players, adjust to league specific, and make sure that you get values and targets based on the ranking list that everybody's going to be looking at during your drafts. So, we went over values and avoids in ESPN, Yahoo, and Sleeper. So making sure that you know where to attack value based on the rankings on any given site is super important. And you want to make sure that you have a command of the ranking sets where you're going to be drafted.
Yeah, so to give some specifics for the different site rankings, it's like Sleeper has Marvin Harrison Jr. as wide receiver 12 and Tyler Warren as tight end 6, where, in Harrison's case specifically, we have him pushed down a decent way further than that. And then with ESPN, it's like they push rookies way down. They have Travis Hunter and Tech McMillan at wide receiver 32 and wide receiver 33. We have both those guys in the early 20s. They've got Emeka Egbuka all the way down at wide receiver 42. So if you are drafting on ESPN, make sure you highlight Egbuka, push him way up. And on the contrary, they still have Zay Flowers as wide receiver 23. So, we've talked at length about Zay Flowers. He was the wide receiver 36 in points per game last season in a year where Lamar Jackson had the best passing career of his life. So, wide receiver 23 just seems like a complete stretch. But in terms of mock drafting there, your league mates will be using their ADPs. So just get kind of an idea of where these guys are going.
Next topic that we're going to go over is staying on top of recent news. So this one is really important, right? Monitoring injuries, depth chart shifts, beat writer updates, and make sure that you have a grasp on what's going on with all of these different things, right? Like something that came up this year specifically was Brian Robinson Jr. was going to get traded. When I saw that news, I was like, that's not a thing. They're not going to be trading their starting running back. They're not doing that. And then obviously that just picked up incredible momentum. So, you know, when something like that breaks, you want to make sure you stay on top of it so you don't end up in a situation where you end up drafting a player that's on the move, monitoring injuries. I know you mentioned with Devon Achane, you were just all over trying to figure out if the calf was going to be good, if they were going to give the all clear or the thumbs up there, right? And so doing these things during the draft, but also during your prep is super important. Making sure, like guys like Terry McLaurin, you continue to watch the contract situations as well. And, you know, it's just one of those things where the more you read about it, the better feel you have for it, the more confidence you have in the decision that you're going to make either to draft somebody or to not draft somebody.
Yeah, with McLaurin, when our home league drafted last Saturday, he had still not yet been signed. You know, he got pushed down a decent ways. And then a perfect example is this week, we got news that Tajay Spears is going to be placed on IR. So that definitely presents a lot of value for Tony Pollard. So in terms of like trying to compile all of this, obviously, if you guys are on Twitter, that's a helpful place to follow beat reporters. But there's a lot of long form YouTube videos that go through recent camp updates. If you say, oh, I don't have the time to watch 2 hours worth of YouTube videos, just take the transcript, summarize it with AI. It'll spit something out. Give me the top 5 most important updates that I need to know before my draft. So just kind of staying on top of that, because one of the guys in our league, you know, he was about to place the sticker on Quinshon Judkins, and we were like, you know, he hasn't necessarily signed with the team. So just things like that, just make sure you waste a roster spot on, you know, somebody that isn't going to be playing or hasn't signed or has a contract dispute.
Yeah. And that one was in like round 8, I think it was. So yeah, we were like, I don't know that that's the best idea.
It was
there.
too early to morally not say something.
yeah. So it was just like, yeah, I think Judkins ended up going like 5 rounds later. So yeah, it was a good call to step in there, but you don't want to be, you know, you want to make sure that you're on top of that. Next point down, I think this one's been gaining momentum too, just in general as a good tool to use, but look at the Vegas odds as a tiebreaker. So you definitely want to look at your over-unders versus your favorite analysts, right? Because they put out projections, right? But Vegas is actually putting up billions of dollars on these lines that they're making, right? So you go through, you just make sure as a sanity check that you're not significantly away one way or the other from the Vegas lines. And I think that's a good litmus test just to not get overly excited or overly down on any player that you think is going to be good or bad. So, you know, it's definitely helpful. I think too that maybe we could explore looking at just projection sets based on Vegas books, right? Just go through and like set up projections and then build a ranking off of that just to see, you know, how Vegas would rank the players, and maybe put that in our spreadsheets next year. But you know, I think this is a great one to use because it's super easy to access the information, and it's you know, super helpful to make sure that you don't get over your skis on somebody like Justin Fields.
Yeah, that was the example I was about to use. A buddy in our draft pushed Justin Fields way up the board. He was looking at his favorite analyst projections. He had him for almost 3,500 passing yards. I pulled up the Vegas projections and showed him that they had him at 2,500, which 1,000 yards off is quite a ways. Now, I know Vegas does build in, you know, things like injuries where analysts don't do that, but that's just a huge delta. And another good example is Calvin Ridley versus Garrett Wilson, right? Like Garrett Wilson is pushed way higher than Calvin Ridley, but their line totals are pretty much identical. I think they've got them both at 925 receiving yards. I think touchdowns are about the same, maybe even higher in Ridley's favor, just because the Jets don't project to score a ton of passing touchdowns. So just be looking at those. If you're on the fence about certain guys, it's a great way to find value. It's a great way to push guys down.
Yeah, another one that I kind of like about Vegas that's a confirmation bias for me, if you will. I was looking at Worthy's upper end touchdown odds, right? So you look at when he goes into his odds to score 10, his odds to score 12. You know, his odds in general aren't necessarily the best in terms of yardage and scoring, but when you get up into the odds of 10 and 12, it's like he's got the same odds as somebody like Nico Collins and somebody like Brian Thomas Jr. when you get up there with the odds. So I thought that was interesting that they're not giving him longer odds to score a lot of touchdowns. So I think, it's a niche one, right? It's not necessarily something you would use to project. It's still super long odds, but the players that are around him at that area, I feel like can maybe even highlight upside in guys that that you might not think, and I think that has to do a lot with playing with Mahomes, being a deep threat, and with Rashee Rice's impending injury. It just is like they're trying to avoid people putting money on Xavier Worthy at super long odds, but it's just an interesting another interesting one that I saw. So, and I drafted Worthy, so confirmation bias. The last point we're going to talk about here is filling out your bench with a purpose. So you want high upside rookies, handcuff strategy, right? Like Charbonnet to Ken Walker, Brian Robinson to Christian McCaffrey, and then not getting a second tight end, kicker, or defense. I think that's usually a good tactic. Now for me, I went in on a second tight end just because I picked two with my last two picks of the draft, and I got Tyler Warren and Evan Engram. So I feel like that was kind of a niche situation there. I like both of them a lot and just trying to make sure I get one. But in general, right, you want to make sure that if you go in on running backs early, right, you start that robust build, that you follow through on that, right? We had one of our friends in the draft to pick two running backs in the first two rounds and then didn't take another one. That's something that you want to, like when you're filling out your bench, you want to make sure it shapes how your starters also look. If you're strong at wide receiver, lean into that and make sure your bench is strong at wide receiver. If you're strong at running back, lean into that. Make sure your bench is strong at running back, because you don't want to be in a situation where bye weeks or injuries turn your greatest strength into a weakness, because that's how you end up with a team that doesn't compete very well. So, I think too, drafting starters can also help as well. And I know, as cliche as that sounds, it's like, well, Javonte Williams is somebody maybe that's not super exciting and doesn't really fit one of these things that we're talking about, but he's a starter. So draft him maybe a couple spots above where you would think. Same thing with Jaylen Warren. I know I drafted him in our league, but he's going to be the starter to start the year. Just draft him, right? Jerome Ford. It looks like he's going to be the starter to start the year. As much as I like Dylan Sampson, it's like, maybe let's just draft the starter and see how that plays out, right? So there's definitely examples again this year at the running back position. We talk about him every year. Chuba Hubbard was that guy last year. There's just a lot of different ways that you can approach filling out your bench, and you want to try and make sure that every roster spot and every draft pick that you make has intrinsic value that you're going to be able to parlay into the year, whether it's through trades or whether it's through avoiding the landmines on the waiver wire, right? The guys that get recommended as 20% fab bids that you don't end up getting because you're like, no, my bench is really solid.
Yeah, and then obviously with the no second tight end, like please, if you draft like George Kittle, don't take a second one. And then depending on what platform you draft on, like Sleeper, for example, you don't have to leave the draft with your with a kicker or a defense. Now, if you are watching this like right before you draft, like you're going to need those guys anyway. But one thing that you and I typically do is, we won't draft a kicker or defense. We'll draft someone that's, maybe IR candidate. We'll move that guy into the IR spot, pick up someone else from the wire, because with still a week left until the season kicks off, like there's more injuries that can pop up. You do want some flexibility, and then you can just pick up whichever kicker, for example. And then with the handcuff strategy, I know we've kind of harped on this in previous episodes, but don't necessarily be all in or married to that handcuff. So obviously with Charbonnet specifically, we know what he is if Kenneth Walker misses time. And if you want to use a roster spot on him, that's totally fine, because he's going to be the hottest waiver wire ad should Walker go down. However, in the case of other players where it's like, okay, we don't necessarily know with Kyron Williams if it's going to be Blake Corum or Jarquez Hunter. We don't know in the case of James Conner how good Trey Benson's actually going to be. So especially if you have a shallower bench, those roster spots are extremely valuable, and everyone you give up for a handcuff, especially in the beginning of the season when injuries are much less likely, you're missing out on a potential lotto ticket on a late round flyer, someone like a rookie wide receiver or something along those lines. So obviously as the season goes on and we get closer to the fantasy playoffs, like, and your rosters are set, go ahead and lock in, all the handcuffs that you need. But just kind of keep that in mind as you build out your bench.
All right. And with that is the tips for cramming for your fantasy football drafts. Thank you for watching. We'll talk to you in the next one.